My name's Geoff Butcher. I'm an economist for the last 40 odd years. I started working with the Institute of Economic Research, worked for a year at Lincoln University as a lecturer there. They offered me a permanent position, by which time I'd accepted a 2-year position in Tonga, senior economist in the Ministry of Finance. Don't get much higher than that in Tonga. And then for the last 30 years I've been a self-employed economic consultant, which really means looking at problems from a particular viewpoint and telling people what I think my answers are. So I've more or less stopped being an economist. Back in post-earthquake I started to get involved in housing projects, affordable housing projects. I did one out at Wigram, I did it as a cooperative. And really I was thinking of red zone people, thinking, you guys, even if you've got a fair payout for your land, we won't argue about that, but you're buggered because what you got was 80,000 and the cheapest section you can buy is 150 or whatever. But if we do it as a cooperative, you can save about 1/3 of the cost of the section. So we did that project, 40 sections, lots of problems to sort out, but managed to do that. It's much easier now with a new, you can raise a couple of $1 million much more easily than you used to be able to, without having to have prospectuses and all that palaver. And so I...
Sample of your left lung.
Just about, yeah. My only disappointment in that project was the fact that most of the people who got involved didn't want to live there. Because you can save 30% of the value of your section, but you have to take on the risk. And as a developer, your biggest risk is usually nobody wants to buy your section at the other end because the market's collapsed or whatever. But if you are the buyer, you don't have the risk. You are the buyer. You don't need to find somebody else. So that was my theory. So we did that, finished that. Then I started looking on the community housing trusts with the former Mayor Gary Moore and a couple of other guys, and we did a few houses, and I've discovered that I'm better at building houses than at managing people who need to buy them, because that's the really difficult bit. You might be able to build an affordable house, and I was interested in ownership, but to do that you have to find the people who want to be owners, and you have to take them by the hand and lead them through the whole process. And for people who've never done it before, that's up to a 2-year project. So I learnt that while we did this, but by the time I'd learnt it, it was kind of a bit late. So then I decided I'd do another project, and that was down at Southshore. Now, why did I choose Southshore? First, because I think it's a really cool place to live. I don't live there, never have done, but I've often walked around there, and I really like Southshore. Second, because if you found the right piece of land, it was firstly cheap, which was what I was interested in, because I'm interested in affordable housing. And so I thought, well, we'll find a piece of land, and it was not in the high flood hazard zone. Now that means that under the city plan you can subdivide it. Unfortunately, under the city plan, most of this is for me rather than for you. I wanted to do it as a cooperative because that would save people a chunk of money, but people weren't interested. There were people interested in buying the sections, but not in taking the risk. And the reason they didn't want to take the risk was, as you all know, the Christchurch City Council really doesn't want development to happen down on South Shore. Now, my attitude was that if I buy the right piece of land, which is not in the high flood hazard management zone, it's just in the flood management zone, we have to build this high up off the ground, but we can do it. We talked to the planners at the council and they said, yes, you can. We wish you couldn't, because we don't think you should, but you can. Until we actually got right into the whole subdivision process, and they said, well, we can't stop you, but we can make your life pretty bloody difficult by saying that there is not a coastal hazard section of the district plan in place. And you say logically that means that the existing, from the previous plan, coastal hazards section is in place because it hasn't been replaced. And they say, but we're applying to section, I believe it's 106, but I've probably got that wrong. Section 106 of the Act, which says that in certain circumstances, we have to give consideration to a wider range of issues, which is what we're doing. and the planners recommended that we not be given subdivision consent. So I appealed that to a commissioner and gave my reasons from an economics perspective why I thought it ought to be allowed, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And at the finish of that, we were allowed to subdivide it, but the trade-off I have to make was that we agreed that once sea level has increased by 0.41 metres, which 0.41 was just what they're expecting after 50 years, I think it is. And at 0.41, they don't think there are going to be very significant problems. So at 0.41, if it goes above that, you have to agree, everybody, it'll be on the title, everybody who buys a bit of land will have to shift their house. So you have to build houses that can be shifted, and after 0.41 metres, people have to shift their houses. So I've advertised them. You can see the ad on Trade Me still. It's what I would call a full disclosure ad. It tells you exactly what the issues are, and basically says if you understand these issues and you like South Shore and you know that you might lose your land in 40 or 50 years' time, or 30 or 60, with a lot of uncertainty, then this could be the site for you. So the section's $120,000, which meets my definition of affordable. I'm not with the government on its definitions of affordable of being between 400,000 and 550,000. That is not affordable. So we've finished that subdivision. We do not yet have our...
Sorry, you have finished it.
We have finished it. Everything physical has been done. We are about to apply for... We have applied for the Section 224, which is basically a certificate from council saying you've done everything, and that takes council a while to get their heads around that, and I just am scared that they'll come back and say, well, there's a problem, but there shouldn't be, but we'll find out.
They will come back with the problem. Yeah.
We've been through all the problems so far, so maybe they'll come back and say there's another one, but we'll see. So the next question to me was, well, what are the issues from a Resource Management Act perspective and an economics perspective? And the Resource Management Act, under Section 5, which is kind of the purpose of the Act, says a whole bunch of things, but it says that part of the purpose of the Act is to enable people to provide for their economic and social well-being. And building affordable houses meets that criteria. And Section 7 of the Act talks about enabling efficient use and development of natural physical resources. Now, as soon as you say efficient, an economist says, I know about efficiency, that's what I spend my life thinking about. And this is where I think that the economist in me parts ways with the planners. Efficiency, to me, means there are trade-offs. You're going to get the greatest benefit for a given cost, or you're going to get a given benefit for the least cost. I mean, there are different ways of looking at the same thing. What it doesn't say is that you're going to pursue an outcome regardless of the cost. And I think that the planners, they tend to go that way. They said, we think there's an outcome here. We're worried about the long term of what's going to happen in 100 years, and we don't really care about, we're going to stop you developing there. And I'm saying, well, the cost of that is that you're going to stop a whole lot of benefits occurring between now and whenever it is we have to retreat from South Shore. I'm not trying to deny that climate change is occurring. I'm saying that on the best information we have, there are probably 40, 50, 60 years of being able to live down on South Shore, enjoying the benefits of it, etc. And that's an economically efficient thing to do.
Because there will be a time, because I'm on the coastal hazards thing.
Yep.
Which is with Sarah, and a bit of it's over my head. But there is a time where someone has to say, enough, retreat.
Mm.
And they say, oh, you can't use the R word. I said, well, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
It might be 2,150 that it happens, but it will happen.
And it might be 2050.
It could be.
And
Might not happen at all.
Exactly.
yeah, that's possible. I mean, I think that's extremely unlikely, but I
It's
mean,
going to happen at some point.
It would- but to me, we don't even need to really go down the argument of how long. We have to say,
Logical. Yeah, like basically,
that the information you're working on says that at least the 0.4 metres is 40 to 60 years away. Then in section 6 of the Act, it talks about management of risks from natural hazards. And I think that that word management is really important, because I think the planners, they are right into, and when I say the planners, I don't know exactly who in council drives the idea that we shouldn't do anything about that. But to me, they're not trying to manage risk, they're trying to avoid risk. And the avoidance of risk comes at a huge cost. So efficiency is about trade-offs. Avoidance of risk is not about trade-offs. It's about, I don't care how much it costs, I'm going to avoid the risk. And to me, as an economist, that's an absurd approach. You never pursue one objective regardless of the cost. That's just inefficient. So, as an economist, I think about the short, the medium and the long term. Are you guys familiar with the concept of a discount rate? It's a bit like an interest rate. It just says something today is worth more than something next year. Not because of inflation, that's kind of a different concept. But just humanity prefers something now to later. And so if you have a whole stream of future benefits, you can basically say, well, that's equivalent, like getting $100 a year every year from now until eternity is not worth $5 billion. It's because, well, 100 for eternity, that's worth an infinite number. It's worth probably, $300 or $400 given to you today. And that is a thing called a net present value, and it just takes account of the fact that none of us actually care about 200 or 300 years in the future. I did a course with people in Turkey about 10, 15 years, probably 25 years ago now, and I asked them about their discount rates, and this woman who spoke very good English and was very switched on said, my discount rate's 30%. I said, no, forget inflation, because Turkey's got 25% inflation at the time. She said, I have forgotten inflation. I said, why is your discount rate so high? She said, with this government, who the hell knows what's going to happen next year? Are we going to get taken to war, given my nationality and ethnicity? So some people have very high discount rates. When we make economic decisions, we always have to sort of ask the question, well, whose discount rate are you going to use? And for a long time, government in New Zealand used 10%. And it meant that, and that was because we were chronically short of capital. And we're, to my mind, wrongly, in fact, any economist would say it's inappropriate to use a high discount rate to ration capital. But anyway, so that we had this 10% discount rate. Now it's officially 6%. And now with the cost of capital and the shortage of alternative interesting things to do, you'd think maybe it ought to be 4%. Now that's just a financial measure of a discount rate, what I could get with my money somewhere else. But there's also something that we often call a social rate of time preference, which is how much do we want something today rather than next year. And farming is always an interesting example of that, because farmers are making their own decisions, they're making long-term decisions, and if you watch irrigation systems, well, there was a really good example. Farmers put in concrete sills on when they had flood irrigation, they'd put concrete sills on the lip of where the water goes out. Concrete sills are expensive. This is quite a low flow of water, you didn't need concrete sills, you could just grass them, but they will wear away. And the implication is that farmers care quite a lot about the future. And if you look at the decisions farmers make, their discount rates are about 3 or 4%. Either that or they're pretty stupid. And my observation of them is they're not pretty stupid. They actually care about the future, and they don't discount it very highly. They care quite a lot about the future. So we typically, social rates of time preference are about 3 or 4%. When we're making decisions down at South Shore or anywhere else where we've got the problem of eventual retreat from the coast, if we have to do that, we should be considering the costs and benefits every year between now and then. Now, my worry with the planners is that they seem to be saying the Act tells us to look 100 years out. And it does. I actually can't find 100 years anywhere in the Act. It says, basically take a long-term view. And then you get all these national policy statements, which I thought were supposed to be based on the Resource Management Act, but seem to me to shift away from them a bit. But you've got to take a long-term view, which to me means worrying about every year between now and whenever we have to retreat. Not saying eventually we have to retreat, therefore we can't do anything from today on. So as an economist looking at the RMA, they need to consider the entire time flow, not just out there. Now, you've said in some of your stuff to me, Warwick, that we need to, you think the council's taking a very precautionary approach, and that's what the RMA says. Now, I did a search of the RMA. You download the Act, do a search on Adobe, and it does not come up with the word precaution or precautionary. It's not in the Act. So people talk about taking a precautionary approach, which really means they want to take, for many people, it's a risk-averse approach. Well, my wife would say I'm a risk lover, and so would some of the other people with whom I deal. I would like to say I do some careful analysis and I'm risk neutral. I don't want to avoid risk at any cost. I say we should take that risk. Your ditch that you dug is a bloody good example. Yes, we might have a problem, but there's quite a big cost if we don't do anything. You want me to avoid the cost of doing something. I want to weigh up the two. I want to do something because the weighing up says it's worthwhile. I'm not taking a precautionary approach, which some people seem to take to be avoid risk at all costs. And I can't see anything in the Resource Management Act, which is the guiding bit of paper really, which says you should take a precautionary approach. To me, it says you should think about everything. If you go back to when the RMA came into place, it replaced a thing called the Town and Country Planning Act, which had got to, it was yay thick, and it had regulations for Africa, and Geoffrey Palmer, bless his cotton socks, said, what we need is a less prescriptive piece of legislation. We need to have something that says you can do things unless you're told you can't. And that is my mental recollection of sort of the underlying ethos of the RMA was to be less prescriptive, more allowing. Well, you read through the Christchurch or any other district plan and you think, it's that thick. It's full of things that I'm not allowed to do. So I can do anything I like, so long as I don't do anything that I'm not allowed to do. And this is full of things which I'm not allowed to do. I can't have my eaves closer than so much to the boundary. Don't have a problem with that because you shade your neighbour's son. If I'm in Castle Hill, I have to use schist to be in character. If you're over at Littleton, where I'm looking at a project now which I've walked away from, we have to be in the character of Littleton, or a mate of mine's doing a project at Sumner. We have to be in the character of Sumner. You say, but if I look at the existing character of Sumner, it's a complete mishmash. It's grown up over 120 years of people doing pretty much whatever the hell they liked until you started telling them they couldn't. And there is no character there, but you're trying to impose one. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't get too carried away there. So the outcome of the RMA to me was that councils basically went back to the Town and Country Planning Act. Now, I'm fascinated by the fact that Judith Collins and the National Party, followed by the Labour Party pretty much, and Jacinda, think that they're going to, one way or another, they're going to reform the RMA and get rid of it. They'll find it really bloody difficult. We reformed the Town and Country Planning Act and got rid of it and created the RMA, which is about as complex. It's not easy because you've got all of these trade-offs that you're having to make. And if you just let people do what they like, they get pretty greedy. They think, oh, I'll build 3 stories here because I'll get a great view of the sea. Bugger my neighbours, bugger their son, bugger everything else, Some people are very concerned about their neighbours, other people don't care. So you get rules. A general rule of economics for efficiency is let the market rip. Except setting aside issues of social equity, which I'm only setting aside for the purpose of economics, which generally ignores them. It says there's 2 reasons to intervene in the market. One is ignorance, and one is because of externalities. You're familiar with the concept of an externality. It is something which you don't take into account when you make your decisions, but it affects other people. And if there's an externality, you can't let the market rip. People will look after their own interests and bugger their neighbours. Now, lots of people actually care a lot about their neighbours, and so they don't say that, but there's quite a few people who take the other attitude. So when you've got externalities and monopolies and a whole bunch of other things, there's a reason to interfere in the market. And that is what I believe we're seeing down on South Shore and the coastal thing generally. The council is arguing that there's ignorance and there's externalities. Now, I think we ought to deal with those two things not by saying you cannot build down on South Shore. In the case of ignorance, you have to let people know what you expect the outcomes to be. Now, to me, that means putting stuff on your limb. Now, I know that 5 or 10 years ago, there was a huge outcry about that. People were saying, you can't put stuff on the limb, it will devalue my land. And my counter-argument would be, actually, your land is worthless. What you want to do is to sell it to somebody who doesn't realise that yet. Other people would say, actually, the limb is misguided. The limb is there saying there'll be sea level rise, and I don't believe a word of it.
The limbs used to always have liquefaction on it, and nobody took any notice.
Yeah, exactly.
What is this word? Don't even know what it is.
And that, I had a strong dispute with a colleague of mine, another economist, who said, and I said, put it on the limb and let people make up their own choices. He said, Geoff, they're too dumb. I said, okay, there's a trade-off to be made. We're protecting people from their stupidity, but it's coming at quite a high cost. You're imposing regulations saying you can't do anything down there. If we've got externalities down there, an economist would say, well, internalise them. Stop them being so that when I do something that costs you, make it so that it costs me. And true to my philosophical beliefs that they should be internalised, when the council came back to me and the commissioner came back to me and he said, I can see all your arguments. I would be minded, not I'm going to, but I would be minded to let this go ahead if you agreed that the houses had to be removed after 0.41 metres of sea level rise. I said, okay, I will agree to that. I hadn't agreed to it initially because, in my view, I should have been allowed to rely on the district plan which said this is not the high flood hazard management zone and you bastards shouldn't be trying to undermine it. Well, you end up saying, well, I'm not going to win that argument. I regard the negotiated compromise as acceptable for two reasons. One is, I think that if a house has to be moved from off there, that if I'm the guy that's built the house, I should have to pay to move it. I should not be compensated by the rest of the community. And that's the externality argument that everybody's worried about. We'll get 50 years down the track and Geoff Butcher will say, but it's not fair. My house is being flooded. And,
all the time.
and I just wish politicians would have the guts to say, yeah, it was on your limb. It's been on there for 80 years now. Your problem. Now, political reality might be that when you get 500 people bitching and moaning, the politicians just don't have the guts to say, still your problem, all of you. There's the reality is, I know, because we've seen it in, the best example are airports around the world. People build next door and they have to have double glazing and all the rest of it, and after 15 to 20, 30 years, there's hundreds of the buggers there, and they petition the council to make the airport close early, and the council caves in, which it shouldn't, in my view. So that's how I would deal with the two problems of ignorance and externalities.
Except that it doesn't deal with the politicians caving in, does it?
No, it doesn't. And we can basically bugger people up by saying politicians are weak. Or we can say, if you're going to vote in weak politicians, that's your problem. Vote some in who've got the balls to say, no, it's your problem. So I sort of thought about what the externalities on South Shore are, and one of them is the protective works that are currently being proposed. The people who live there can maybe claim ignorance. I've met quite a lot of people who've lived there 30, 40, 50 years. 30, 40, 50 years actually, or I can take you back to things that I wrote from Tonga in 1988, where we were talking about global warming, and I was by no means the first person to be aware of it. But people generally weren't aware of it 20 years ago. So you could say they've got a kind of a case, and that's an argument that's happening at a national level, not an argument, a debate as to what the hell are we going to do with all these people whose houses are going to have to disappear sometime in the next 50 years, and we don't know the answer to that yet. But to put in place protective works there, especially for my benefit, and I knew full well when I developed down there that flooding was likely to be a problem, if we make the whole of the Christchurch rating base pay, or the whole of ECAN's rating base, or the general taxpayer, that's an externality. And my concern as an economist is that because of the weakness of politicians, that we end up as a planner almost saying, I know politicians are weak, I know that they will give in, because they give in there will be an externality, therefore I should stop Geoff Butcher developing down on Southshore. Follow the argument? And it's just extremely frustrating that because of gutless politicians I'm not allowed to develop down there, because I think it's in the interest of the people who want to live there to go and live there. So should all ratepayers pay? Well, no, they shouldn't. Not for me anyway. And certainly, if we put it on a pro rata basis, and I'll come to some numbers later, of about $750 a household a year, certainly anybody who's built down there or rebuilt down there in the last 10 years, or sorry, purchased there really, we should say, they should have to pay their own way. Maybe the people who lived there a longer period, you can have an argument that they didn't know. And it's pretty tough, but I'll also come to something which say, actually the cost of them is not that big. The other thing people say is, oh, insurance. Everybody's premiums will go up. Well, no, the insurers are pretty bloody good at that. The premiums will only go up for the people who live on South Shore. I have to build 1.6 roughly metres above the ground. I think I'll be okay for insurance. I don't have a lot of faith in insurers because they're pretty stupid. I did work in the Heathcote and at Lake Wakatipu 20, 30 years ago. In the Heathcote we had 3 1 in 80 year floods, whatever the hell it was, within 5 years, and the insurers wouldn't insure anything. They said, oh, they're happening all the time. And I kind of understand their point of view. Queenstown had 2 1 in 100 year floods within 5 years or 10 years. Insurers wouldn't insure anything for 5 years. And then they said, oh, it hasn't happened lately. Perhaps we'll take the risk after all. So, I mean, I don't think they're that good at assessing risk. But I think that if I build that high, I will be able to get insurance. If I sit down there, I think I won't be able to get insurance within the next 5 to 10 years. Might be 20. And I might find that global warming doesn't occur and I can continue to get insurance. But generally speaking, the insurance to me is not an externality. The insurers are pretty good at making the people who have the risk, they make us pay. So what did I say? For protective works, we should have a local specialised rate. That would get rid of some of the externality. We should require people to move their houses if that has to happen. The general community shouldn't pay. Our insurance markets will sort themselves out. The problem, as we discussed earlier, is just the political realities. Squeaky wheels. People who bitch and moan and aren't prepared to take responsibility for their own decisions. That's just what happens. So then I started thinking, and I wrote a note to Warwick, or maybe it was to New Brighton Observatory. What's that guy's name?
Simon what?
Simon, yeah. And said, well, what are the costs and benefits of Southshore Development? And, you know, I'm assuming that most of you know South Shore and something about it. It's basically a neat environment. It's got all this existing infrastructure. There's buses go up and down the road. There's sewer, there's power, there's water, there's phones. So there are economies of scale for infrastructure. For each extra section that I created, I had to pay $23,000, which was less than out at Wigram, which was $35,000. But I'm prepared to bet that if somebody did some detailed analysis of the actual additional costs of building down on South Shore, it would be a bloody sight less than $23,000 because everything's there. Although it's quite interesting if you ever look through that in detail, a lot of the extra costs go to things like regional parks. As we get bigger as a city, and if we do have more people down there, wherever they go in the city, you will need more parks. Arguably, it's good to have more people down there, and in fact, the woman who wrote the decision, the planner's report on my application, she actually wrote a very good and a very fair and balanced report. She did say things like, well, you know, the city plan says we ought to have more people in places like this. Places like this being places which are suitable for development, not places on South Shore. And you could have improved neighbourhood amenity. I mean, there used to be, I think, a store at this end of Brockenhorse Road. There isn't anymore. But I'd love to have, if I had nothing else to do with life, I'd probably open a coffee shop about 3/4 of the way down, almost on the front lot of the land that I developed. But you get things like that, which eventually more people does or can increase urban amenity. Other people down there think, I don't want any more development down here. It was better when there were half as many people, and more people is worse. But the real thing I thought it has going for it, the costs and benefits, it's cheap land. Now, I bought that land, if you add on all the subdivision, all the costs, including about probably $50,000, which it's cost to deal with the council, specialist reports and all the rest of it, it still comes out to, I can sell those sections at $120,000 and make 10 grand a section. Now, I know that a proper developer will want 30 grand a section, and I'm not a proper developer, as I keep being told by various people whom I deal with, and say, Geoff, you're not taking this properly seriously. I'm taking it quite seriously, but I don't see that I need to make a fortune. And I think that you'd get cheap land, which would suit those people, either who have a high discount rate, and I've had, of the 8 sections, we've sold 6. I took 2 off the market because I'd kind of like to build some houses down there with a mate of mine at minimal cost. You know, it's kind of nice. I haven't built a house probably for 30 years. It's time to build another one.
Have you got nothing to do?
Well, I know, it can get a bit time consuming. But there are people who can afford $120,000 and they can't afford $180 or $200 or whatever it is. Even at Rolleston now, it's $180,000, which is way the hell out of town. Some people have high discount rates, and some of these people who've come and talked to me, I said, you understand that it won't be there in 40 to 60 years. Yeah, I understand. I've got 25 years to live, and I don't give a stuff about the future, or my kids because I haven't got any, or my kids because I've provided for them, or my kids because they're a complete pain in the ass not to sort themselves out, or whatever. Some people have that, they say, 40 years is fine for me. Other people would say, yes, I understand that we're gone, and I do care about the future, but I'm going to save $80,000 on the land and live in a really nice place for 50 or 60 years. And I accept that at the other end, it'll be gone. But that, to me, is a sensible trade-off. I'm not risk averse. I don't think it's all going to disappear in 10 years' time. I'm not a real optimist. I don't think it's going to take 110 years. But given what we know, yeah, I'm okay with that. And the last thing to me, which is quite important, and this is, economics always used to be called political economy, because people who think that there's no politics in economics just don't understand economics. As you remember me saying earlier on, economics usually doesn't care about income distribution. A whole lot of stuff when we talk about efficiency doesn't worry about that. Well, that's a political decision. I'm not going to worry about that. It's too hard to cope with, actually. So it enables self-determination. And I mean, there's a huge amount of people down there who've got awfully pissed off at not being allowed to do, in my case, what the plan said I could do. In other people's place, they are in a high flood hazard management zone, and the change in the plan means that they can't build there, but that was a pretty arbitrary decision. So I think that that's a significant cost of stopping development, or be a significant benefit of enabling development. So here's the first, I thought about the cost effectiveness. So we've got a discount rate, or social rate of time preference, is 3 to 5% per annum. Let's assume that something's going to be worth nothing after 30 to 50%. That's like having to pay an extra 8% to 43% now. The 8% is if you've got a 3% discount rate and it disappears in 50 years. It's like you're saying, how much do I care? If I don't lose the money until way out there, my loss is equivalent to about 10% of what it's currently worth, 8%. If I've got a bit of a higher discount rate and it's going to disappear in 30 years, well, actually it's worth 43% less than I'd normally pay. Then you think, okay, down there, what's the property value? Let's say $400,000. That's a pretty cheap property down there, but there are plenty down there for that. It's going to cost you $50,000. The houses I'm doing now, it's going to cost you $50,000 to relocate your house. It's going to cost you $25,000 to jack it up and shift it, and $25,000 to build a foundation and put some services in and drop it down at the other end. So it's $50,000. The value of the land now is 150, let's say. So it's total of $200,000. That is at risk. So 200,000 of my 400,000 is at risk. The other 200,000 is the house that I'm going to shift. So about half of my investment is at risk. So the loss that I'm going to get on that half is half of 8 to 43%, which is to say 4 to 23%. That's what I'm going to lose if I'm a rational person, think I'm going to lose my house eventually, have to shift the house, have no value of the section. It's like saying, well, I should be prepared to pay something between 4 and 22% of the current value. It's worth that much less because I'm going to have to shift eventually. It seems to me as an economist to be pretty rational for somebody to say, given what a bargain it is to live down there, and given the fact that I really want to, a 4% loss, well, that's bugger all. Oh, I'll go with that. Even if it's a 20% loss, or 23% loss, yeah, I'd still go with that because, well, you think how much money I've saved for how long I've saved it. $100,000 cheaper on the section. So as an economist, I would say it's an efficient use of resources to let people build down there, if you think their houses will last between 30 and 50 years.
Can I just ask, so the cost of that relocation, that's based on today's prices, or is that estimated for the future as well?
No, I do everything in today's prices because general inflation will take everything up. It'll cost me more to shift, but it'll still be 50% or whatever it's worth back out then, yeah.
I guess it's going beyond this, but to factor in, there is also like a bet, if you like, in terms of, is it 50 years or is it 100 years or is it 150 years? So
there is that bet, and you can't get away from that uncertainty. Some people are risk neutral. They'll say, best guess is what I've been told by the council. Other people have done more work like you and say, I'm a bit sceptical about their best guess for these various reasons. Some people will say, I hate risk, and I've had a couple of people I say, you understand the risk? And they said, oh, I'm a bit nervous about it. I said, well, it's not the place for you. You're risk averse. You shouldn't go and live there. You're somebody who's going to be shattered if in 15 years' time the tides come in. Me, I'm going to be pissed off, but I'm just going to pick up my house and shift it. You know, some people can deal with risk and others can't. So that was the cost effectiveness one. That's economics, cost effective, Resource Management Act, efficient use of resources, let them build. So this is a bit of repetition, but we were talking about the Southshore Repair and Adaptation Strategy, which has been put together. And I think that it enables people to provide for their social and economic well-being in a way that represents an efficient use of natural resources, taking into account the identified natural hazard of flooding both now and in the future, which to me says that under the RMA and even under the Coastal Hazards National Policy Statement, probably, you should be allowed to develop down there. Of course, we have to take into account the expectations of climate change. That just doesn't mean you can't do anything forever. Think about the interim. And the crucial thing, I think, which I'm happy, that's the other reason I was happy to accept a shift your house after 0.41 metres. It doesn't say shift your house after 20 or 50 or 80 years. It says shift your house when something happens. And given that uncertainty, it's pretty absurd to tie actions to timelines. What happens if we find that the tides come in much more slowly than we expected? Sorry?
Or starts to go the other way.
Yes, yeah, yep. So efficiency basically says if the net present value cost of a repair, so I talked about net present values, you know, we're going to spend the money now, we're going to get some benefits over a whole, I'm going to be able to live there for an extra 20 or 30 years and that's got benefits to me every year. The efficiency just says if the benefits are greater than the costs, get on with it. Who should pay is partly political. There's that what's socially fair, and people will have highly diverse views on that. The other reason that I think that the people who live there should pay is an economic argument on the grounds of its incentives. If I'm living there and I know that you guys are going to pay, I think it's going to be really cheap to build that wall and it's going to be fantastically valuable. Though there's this incentive to distort the realities because I'm not paying.
I don't know if it's a good time to mention this, but I wanted to mention that at some point in this, the concept of a social contract. I don't know if I've talked to you about this, but the bigger overlay of this, where in a society we all pay rates, we live together, we protect each other's backs to an extent. So for example, as a ratepayer, I pay rates to the council and ECAN build a whole lot of big expensive flood walls along Waimak to protect the folks of West Christchurch in case the Waimak River rediverts through Western Christchurch. So it's a question of where that social contract starts and ends, where we get each other's backs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And I think that on South Shore, there's a small number of people, and especially new developers like me, are deliberately and willingly taking a risk. And I think that the social contract of the Waimakariri, and that will, if it goes, it could go right through to Lake Ellesmere. Who the hell knows where it'll go? You know, there's some interesting flood paths through the Waimakariri. So that's a really wide group of people. And the social contracts on other things, which I pay for some flood relief works, they all vary according to where you live up and down the Halswell River, for example. So I fully agree that there is a question of what is a social contract and where does society want to draw that particular line, and that's a huge issue that we're going to face over the next 30 to 50 years if global warming proceeds at the rates that people expect. So anyway, so I thought I'd do some more things about the cost effectiveness. How many houses are there down there? Well, I used Google Earth and I counted them all up, and I thought South Shore said around about 425. So 425 houses. Gary Tier has estimated that it'll cost 8 million odd. I put 8.2. I don't know if that's what he said or if that's what I've... But I think it was about $8 million to put up this levy that he was proposing. I don't know what the current estimates are.
6.
Sorry?
It might drop to about 6.
Oh, okay, even less, right. How long will this... Let's assume it provides protection for 50 years, and that could be wrong. And then I said, well, how much would people have to pay every year for the net present value of their stream of future payments? Let's say it's it's a special rate levied on people down there, to equal $8 million. And it comes to $750 per house per year. $750 gives you $0.3 million a year, and the net present value of that at 3% over 50 years is the 8.2 million. If it's only a 25-year lifetime, then it becomes $1,100 per house per year that you'd have to pay as an extra rate to fund that work. Obviously, that assumes that you thought the social contract said, no, you guys down there can pay for it. It's entirely your benefit, you can pay. Now, if I lived down there, I would think, good, where do I sign? Get on with it. Some people obviously will say, I'd love to sign it, but I simply can't afford that. You know, there's issues there that, don't know how you resolve those. But I think that if you ask the people down there, would it be worth $750 a year? Well, they'd all say yes. Even the ones who couldn't pay for it would say, well, certainly worth that, but I can't afford it, but it's worth that. So then I turned it on its head slightly and said, well, if the value per property is 400,000, the property at risk is 170 million. Now, if I was in the Christchurch City Council, I could have got the rateable value at the press of a button virtually, but I don't have their GIS systems. So they would be saying it's not 170 million, it's 217.46 million, or whatever they would tell me. And if there's a 3% annual value of saving them, so if you like the value of saving them each year, this concept of it's being worth 3% to not destroy something, it's worth 5 million a year. And the net present value of looking after them is 102 million. Sorry, 5.1 million for 20 years is 102 million, but if you think, well, money that I don't get now is worth less than if I get it now. That 102 million, 5 million a year for 20 years, is equivalent to getting 76 million today. Because I'd rather have a lump now than a dribs and drabs over the years. So did I explain that well? We could get 5 million a year for 20 years. That's 100 odd million. But if I got it all today rather than having to wait for 20 years, well, I'd accept rather less to get it all today. Don't have to wait for 20 years to get the last bit of it. That's about 76 million. 76 million compared to, what was it, Mr. Tier? 8 million? Seems like a pretty bloody good deal to me. Let's get on with it. One of the reasons that I understand council are really reluctant to let the flood protection occur is then people who are inside the flood protection will say, oh, I'm all right now, it's worth developing. And they will, and it would be rational for them to do so, which is basically what I'm saying. At the moment, with those 425 houses, if that's the right number, there will come a point in time at which you say, it's not worth our while to build those walls any higher. Sorry, bugger off. But if there were 1,000 houses inside the wall, oh, well, we should build the wall higher for another 20 years. So you would build the wall higher, and you'd say, well, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Well, to me, it still does make sense if it's self-funded. If I was living outside the wall, I'd be saying, I'm not paying more money for you guys to have a bigger wall that you knew was going to be my problem. It's your problem, and that would remove, I think, the incentive to develop at somebody else's cost. So you shouldn't be saying, we shouldn't have development of a flood levy system because that will encourage people to build there. We should say, yes, it will encourage people to build there, and we'll make bloody sure through the things that are on their title that they know they're going to have to pay for it. That way, I don't see a problem.
So this theory would apply to all flood protection everywhere, including up and down Heathcote, for example.
It would. Incidentally, 30 years ago, I wrote a report for the council which said, flood protection Heathcote, said you should buy 30 or 40 of those sites there and stop trying to, the ones that always get flooded. Well, I've finally done it, I see. I don't know how much money they paid out between times, but
We bought some of them for 800 grand and we sold some of them just the other day for about
20,000?
50, 20, nothing. Because
Yeah.
you couldn't build on it.
Yeah, I kept looking at those and thinking, I'd kind of like to buy those. You could put a really interesting community gap. No, stop it, Jeffrey. Stop being stupid. You've already got too many things to do. So what was my conclusion? Well, we get back to markets tend to efficient outcomes in the absence of externalities and imperfect knowledge. The solution is not to regulate against development down there. It is to remove the externalities and improve knowledge and let people make some decisions. Council rules have already managed the risk. You've got to be this high off the ground. As an aside, I was pretty pissed off that I had to spend $20,000 odd on getting a hydrologist to write a report to give the council an answer which they either knew or should have known in order to call it a high flood hazard zone. And everybody who develops down there, I had to do a lesser one when we shifted our house 3 years ago onto 170A Rock and Horse Road. It's just absurd to constantly make people tell you something you already know.
Jump through the same hoop.
Yeah, you either know the answer and you know that Southshore's pretty bloody flat. You know that the answer there is the same as all down there, so stop making people do it again and again. So improve knowledge, put things on the limbs. I'm fine with that. There will be people who say, I can see that's on the limb, and I know it's a load of bullshit. There is no sea level rise going to happen in my lifetime. Fine. You've been warned that that's what we think.
And I'm still happy to buy it.
And you're still happy to buy it? Fine, good, go for it. I don't have a problem. My mate, as I said, does. He thinks people are too stupid. And I think, well, protecting them from their stupidity comes at a really high social cost. I don't think we should pay it. Yeah, that's basically.
How do you factor in the environmental angle? So you have a wall, build a wall higher. There's talk in the policy statements about avoidance of hard barriers, and I think in Southshore it's quite a natural area, and there's certainly kind of a push and a desire, I feel, to have a natural area, i.e. no hard defences. How do you cope with that concept in the construct of economics?
In principle, you cope with it by simply saying, what are these environmental costs that you think are going to occur? So if you look at the environment between my place and the estuary down there, you'd say it's a piece of grass with some hills at the far end, and if I build, and the estuary's out there, and if I build a wall there and it's at the appropriate slope, I'm not sure what costs are going to incur. Certainly we're not going to incur any now, I would have thought. Maybe they'll start to accrue in the future. Economists have spent a lot of time trying to value some of those non-market values, and just about most of the guys I know have given up trying. We had various willingness to pay schemes and various clever things, and they don't work very well. They're really hard to... So it will always come down to a value judgment. I'm just worried that people are making the value judgment, they're not making a trade-off. They're saying there's an absolute value here, and they're not even being explicit about what it is. There is an environmental cost. What is it? To whom?
So maybe it's the council making a value judgment, is that this should be el natural. No.
Well, I don't even know what that means, au naturel. Leave it as it is with the half-broken walls that are there. Leave it as it is with the half-broken walls and build something 50 metres back from that, which is what you could do on most of it. And if it's, let's say, that high, what's the natural environment that I'm somehow degrading? At the moment, it's an area of grass, so I'm going to leave it as an area of grass. But I mean, I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a botanist, I'm not any of those things, and so those people can give their expert advice and opinion to the council and preferably to some commissioners, and who's going to weigh it up against the fact that there's a whole lot of people want to live down there. Why are we stopping them? What benefit would they get out of living there? You can tell what benefit they'd get from living there because they say, well, geez, I'll buy a section down there. That's them saying, taking into account all the things you've told me, there's a benefit to me.